I thought I'd talk about integrated resource plans. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what's contained in an integrated resource plan and what it can tell you about how to plan your electric power system. The main message I'd like to send home is that, we need to be really cognizant and self-aware about what these models can and cannot tell us. There's a lot of faith that's being put into modeling and not a lot of interest oftentimes in understanding what the limitations are, being frank about the limitations of modeling. One of the ways that we can kind of ease that transparency burden is by making modeling software and modeling files freely available to intervener groups. We've seen that happen in a number of jurisdictions over the past couple of years, and it has really opened the door to different takes on how you approach this modeling, on making sure that parties understand the inputs and the model settings in a way that they we're not able to without access to this information. It's hard to remove the barrier of complexity as it relates to these models, but I think making them transparent and freely available goes a long way to reducing that information asymmetry and helps keep everybody kind of level set about what they're assuming, why they're assuming it, what these results mean and what they're a product of.
It could put some guardrails on like how outrageous and shameless the utility can be about using out-of-date cost estimates or something like that.
And sometimes it's not even intentional. Sometimes it's just a product of, we didn't know any better. We're recently speaking with utility that wasn't aware of, how one could treat tax credits for solar and paired solar and battery storage in a way that would allow them to capture the full value of those tax credits, immediately instead of over the life of the asset. And you don't learn these things unless you actually have a chance to talk to the utility and or, look at their modeling files and see that that's happening. Some of it is intentional and some of it is just, they're not aware,
It sounds like that's partially a model thing and partially a just let's take advantage of the tax credits.
Yeah, and I'm not sure why they didn't know that, but it matters from a modeling standpoint, how you represent those tax credits, because they influence what the model spits out as the optimal plan.
You mentioned Big Stone. We did many Big Stone cases over the years, right? I think it was the first one where the company's model runs showed that the optimal plan was to build the plant. It turned out that there were these error messages along the way that they didn't look at and didn't provide to us that said, the model was complaining that it couldn't search all the branches of the optimization space to come up with the optimal plan. And then you basically turn off the plant, which should give you a suboptimal plan, but it came out to be a cheaper plan without the plant, despite what the optimization was, because it was not actually exploring the full possible solution set that included not building this plant.
Yeah, that was a problem with dynamic programming models like Strategist, where essentially it iterates every single feasible plan. But if you have too many solution options, then there are too many feasible plans, and therefore it has to reject a bunch of them. And so it was actually rejecting the optimal plan by a long shot, as I recall.
It's an optimization model, but it only explores a little corner of the solution space or something, and then declares that it's got an optimal plan. And if you ignore the warning messages, then you might go ahead and build a billion-dollar coal plant.
Yeah, and the warning messages were not attached to their testimony.
You would think with modern computers, the scale of these investments, I mean, here we are, we're working on, in some ways, the biggest issue facing humanity at the moment. It's right up there, right, in terms of the energy transition, climate, and clean, reasonably priced energy, reliable energy, and there's hundreds of billions of dollars being invested and spent, and the models are often so lousy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about how much we don't know, though, about what we model in IRPs. I mean, there's been a huge focus on resource adequacy recently, in large degree because of the outages in ERCOT during February of 2021. And a lot of these resource adequacy analyses that are doing things like coming up with the planning reserve margin for IRPs are not based on information that is actually meteorologically correct. They are developing artificial data sets that sample from different time periods for wind versus solar. So you are effectively assuming different weather conditions on, July 1st of 2013 versus July 1st of 2015. And they're not looking at some of the big drivers of why you had outages during that period of time. For example, the load went up dramatically. That's oftentimes not included in those types of analyses. They're not accounting for the fact that In many jurisdictions, thermal outages are correlated with significant extreme cold and extreme hot temperatures. There's a lot of things that we kind of know happen in practice, but we lack the data to analyze these in a kind of analytically robust way. And starting to feel like the industry is kind of waking up to how concerning this is and how much data we lack to do all the things that we're supposed to be doing when we do IRPs, when we say, yes, this plan is going to provide energy adequacy.
I feel like some of the short-term forecasting models, they use machine learning, they use lots of data, and they're very sophisticated about projecting the next 3 days or the next week, and they'll base it on weather and lots of other, but then in terms of the planning models, they make these really simplifying assumptions, like all the different risks are independent from each other, when they're obviously not. Like the heat causes high loads, and sometimes power plant derates or outages, for example. And just also kind of they assume that the operators are doing sensible things, and sometimes they're not. We had Smitty on the show talking about the Texas winter snowpocalypse, and it seems like it was in some way. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of explanations, but some of it was just these kind of like cascading human failures. They're just doing things that didn't make any sense in terms of what loads to keep on. Like shedding loads that are actually important for supplying fuel to the power plants, or why are those loads not on the list of high priority loads? Things like that seem obvious in hindsight, or even in hindsight after the first outage years ago, they were obvious, but then they didn't actually even get implemented.
It's hard to explain, particularly if it happened before, why that wouldn't be accounted for in the future, right? But certainly as it relates to supply of gas in particular, I can kind of understand why that happens, because most of these models don't represent the interaction between the gas infrastructure system and the electric system. So we just kind of assume that the fuel is available. And, if we're buying into this notion that models can help us answer complex questions, then we sometimes don't think about what they aren't telling us, which again goes back to the fact that these models aren't representing everything. There's significant portions of the infrastructure that lead to me being able to turn on the lights in my house that we're not actually modeling. And so it's, I think, really good to be frank and to think about those things. And hopefully the lessons learned from the Texas outage event can help inform other jurisdictions as well.
For sure, and kind of combining electric and gas into some kind of integrated, even if they're not in the same model, kind of thinking about them coherently would seem like it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned load data, or kind of like if you have wind data and solar data and load data, for example, some companies will like come up with a typical year for each of those and then put them together and use the typical, something based on like the last 30 years of observed data, and put that together to create the model inputs. If you do that, you're not necessarily getting the correlations correct among them. And you also may not be getting trends like climate change. I mean, Texas summers seem to be getting significantly hotter. And if you just take an average of the last 20 or 30 or 50 years, you're not going to really predict the future very well.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great point. That's kind of a facet of how we think about electric service in general. We oftentimes look backward to think about performance of generators, and we look backward to think about how load will change over time. Virtually, in fact, I can't think of a single utility that does not use a model, typically a regression-based model, that looks backward at historical loads and says, okay, this relationship between things like heating degree days and cooling degree days and economic drivers like unemployment, manufacturing output, things like that will hold in the future, will not change. And therefore we can, predict load. And you're absolutely right that climate change throws a lot of that kind of out the window. And I think not necessarily just in terms of whether we're getting the number of heating degree days or cooling degree days right, but also in terms of what do those tail events look like? What does it look like when we have extreme cold or extreme heat events?
Or a global pandemic.
Or a global pandemic. That was really difficult to predict, right? And I think unless you were doing your modeling in December 2019 or January 2020, you probably didn't have much of an inkling that a global pandemic was going to happen.
And I'm not suggesting that someone should have predicted that in their IRP modeling, but I think there is an attitude and a humility and a notion that the projections might be significantly wrong that would be helpful.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. Going back to the question of climate change, we're starting to see a handful of utilities who are doing what they call a climate change load forecast. And in general, this seems to be downscaling GCM models to a particular jurisdiction and saying, what impact would that have on load? And some of them seem to suggest that climate change would have very little impact on load. And I'm concerned that that means that they're missing some key drivers here. It may be the case that load moderates to some degree because in shoulder seasons, you have, warmer temperatures than you historically did, and therefore you have less heating load. Even if you have a natural gas furnace heating your house, that still requires electricity to operate. So there is a correlation, broadly between cold temperatures and increased load.
There's how does the climate itself affect the load, and sometimes the resources like the hydro availability and some with rainfall. But then also one of the big items is a climate change is going to affect policies, which is going to drive electrification. And so, like having most vehicles be electric, or, all that gas and oil home heating be heat pumps. That's surely going to drive electric load shapes and electric loads.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think the question about that is not so much, whether that happens or how it happens, or even how quickly it happens, but how does that change over time? How does that change behavior in terms of how much energy people consume and when they consume it? Because some of this, I think, is influenceable. Like, we don't have to assume that everybody has to charge their electric vehicle from 5 to 7 at night during the weekdays. There's a lot of information and I think some curiosity that's needed in order to help answer those questions a little bit better.
And people doing utility rate making and policy and regulators can have some agency in having that all happen in a way that is reasonable rather than.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna, for being on the show. It's really great talking with you.
Yeah, good to see you again. It's been a long time, definitely pre-COVID. So say hi to Jeannie for me, and thanks for having me on the show, Bruce.